In early December of the year 1941, Winston Churchill was at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, when the news he had hoped for finally arrived. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. He would later write that he went to sleep that night with the calm of a man who suddenly felt saved. For more than 2 years, Britain had stood almost entirely alone against Nazi Germany, watching its cities burn under the Blitz, rationing every crumb, fighting on with dwindling strength. And now, at last, the United States was entering the war. But Churchill understood something that would take time to become real. Knowing America would fight was one thing. Seeing American soldiers on British soil, marching through British streets, was something altogether different. That would be the moment when hope turned into reality. Churchill had begun courting American involvement long before the first shots of the war. As First Lord of the Admiralty and later as Prime Minister, he wrote letter after letter to President Roosevelt. Their correspondence became extraordinary in scope, hundreds upon hundreds of personal messages. Churchill often signed himself former naval person, a deliberate attempt to set an intimate tone and bypass layers of cautious diplomacy. Part of it was strategy, but part of it was personal. His own mother had been American, born Jenny Jerome of Brooklyn. He had toured the States, made friends there, always felt a bond. Yet personal sentiment mattered less than necessity. After the fall of France, Britain stood alone in Western Europe. The Soviet Union was still bound by its pact with Germany. Churchill knew that Britain needed not only American weapons and food, but American soldiers. The Lend-Lease Act had kept Britain alive, but crates and convoys could not storm beaches or defend cities. Through the year 1941, as Germany drove deep into Soviet territory, Churchill waited and hoped for the moment that would force America into the fight. Pearl Harbor did what all his speeches could not. On the day after the attack, the United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America. Churchill immediately prepared to cross the Atlantic. He arrived in Washington just before Christmas and stayed into the new year, working with Roosevelt to forge a strategy and solidify an alliance. But discussions in polished rooms were abstract. What mattered most was the arrival of American troops in Britain. The first soldiers landed in Northern Ireland in late January of the following year. They were advance units, the beginning of a tide that would grow with every passing month. More came through the spring and summer, until, by the end of that year, well over 100,000 American servicemen were in Britain. They arrived by convoy, always wary of German submarines, stepping ashore in a country scarred by bombing and exhausted by years of war. The British reaction was complicated. There was deep gratitude, of course, but also tension. The Americans seemed impossibly well supplied. Their pay was higher, their uniforms newer, their rations far beyond what a rationed British household had seen in years. Jokes circulated that the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Humour softened with admiration but edged with resentment. Still, beneath every complaint was something stronger. Relief. Hope. The sense that the tide might finally turn. Churchill felt that more than anyone. He knew the numbers. Germany held most of Europe. Its armies were vast. Britain was holding on, but mere survival was not victory. The Soviet Union was bearing enormous losses. Britain needed America's limitless industrial capacity and its fresh armies. Yet even with all his charts and all his planning, Churchill had not yet experienced the emotional truth of American involvement. That moment would come in London on a grey afternoon when a large contingent of American troops marched through the city in formation. Months had passed since the first arrivals. Americans were now a common sight in Britain. But a full, formal march through the battered heart of London was something different, something symbolic, undeniable. Churchill made certain he would witness it. Churchill positioned himself where he could watch the American columns pass without drawing too much attention. His staff understood the significance of the moment and ensured he had a clear view. London's streets still bore the wounds of the Blitz. Shattered walls, blackened bricks, empty windows staring out like hollow eyes. And along those same streets now came the marching Americans. They moved in long, steady lines, their boots striking the pavement in a rhythm that echoed off the damaged buildings. Their uniforms were clean and well made. Their helmets caught the muted daylight. Rifles rested against their shoulders. Most were barely more than boys, farmhands from the Midwest, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from New York and Boston. They had trained in camps across America, crossed the Atlantic in cramped troop ships, and now found themselves in a nation worn thin by war. Crowds gathered along the sidewalks, drawn by curiosity, gratitude, and something like awe. Office workers spilled out of buildings, shopkeepers leaned in their doorframes, mothers held children by the hands, some waved, some clapped. The soldiers responded with easy grins, a confidence that seemed almost foreign to a city that had spent years under bombardment. Churchill watched in silence at first. His expression was hard to read, though those standing near him later recalled that his eyes were wet. For more than 2 years he had carried on his back the weight of Britain's survival, reading casualty reports, allocating scarce resources, visiting bombed neighbourhoods, sending young airmen and infantry to distant fronts. Britain had endured through willpower alone, through the stubborn refusal to collapse, and now, finally, he saw the reinforcements, not on paper, not in crates, but in flesh and blood. Thousands of Americans with tens of thousands more behind them. The greatest industrial power in the world was entering the fight in full measure. Someone beside him asked quietly what he thought. Churchill did not answer right away. He kept his gaze fixed on the young men passing before him. When he did speak, his voice trembled just slightly beneath its familiar resolve. "When I see these young men," he said, "I know we are going to win this war." The words were simple, but they carried everything he had endured. The nights when invasion seemed imminent, the smoke-filled dawns after bombing raids, the grim telegrams delivered to families, the long strain of defending an island against an empire. He elaborated, almost as if thinking aloud. "They are young," he said, "strong, confident. They have crossed an ocean to help us. They have come to fight for freedom, for civilization itself. Hitler," he declared, "had made his greatest mistake, believing America would remain neutral, believing Britain would collapse before help arrived." Now he faced the combined force of Britain, Russia, and the United States. Churchill wiped his eyes with a handkerchief but showed no embarrassment. "I have waited so long for this," he murmured. Those near him understood perfectly. They too had lived through the years of fear. The fall of France, the desperate battles in Greece and Crete, the relentless submarine attacks, the rationing, the nights in shelters listening to explosions shake the earth. Watching the Americans march was like watching the future arrive. As more columns passed, Churchill's mood shifted from emotional to analytical. He pointed out the quality of their equipment, spoke about the vast factories that produced it, the manpower America could draw upon. The Americans were eager, he noted, full of energy that Britain's tired troops could no longer muster in the same way. They would need training. They would need experience. Britain would teach them what it had learned in 2 hard years of war, and Britain in turn would learn from them. A member of his staff mentioned the growing friction between British and American troops, differences in pay, differences in rations, differences in culture. Churchill waved it off with a short, impatient gesture. Of course there was friction. Put any 2 groups of young men together and there will be rivalry. What mattered was that the Americans were here. Real soldiers. Real power. Allies who could tip the balance. The march lasted more than an hour, column after column filling the streets. Churchill stayed until the very end, long after the last soldier had disappeared from view. It was as if the sight itself replenished a well inside him that had nearly run dry. When the final boots faded into the distance, he turned to his staff. "I want to meet some of them," he said. "Arrange a visit to an American camp. I want to thank them personally." His wish would soon be granted. Churchill began visiting American camps across Britain in the months that followed. Sometimes he arrived with almost no notice, wanting to see the soldiers as they truly were, not polished for inspection, not prepared with rehearsed answers, but living the daily life of men newly arrived in a war-torn country. His presence always created a stir. The unmistakable round figure, the determined jaw, the ever-present cigar. Even American troops who had barely been in Britain knew instantly who had stepped into their midst. He would walk among the rows of tents or barracks, stopping to shake hands, to ask where a man was from, how he was settling in, whether the British climate was treating him well. He wanted them to understand what their arrival meant. In one camp he met soldiers from Texas, and immediately launched into warm praise of their state, its vastness, its energy, its reputation for fighting spirit. In another he spoke to newly landed soldiers still adjusting to the damp air, the rationing, the sense of an older country that had been at war for years. "You have come a long way," he told them. "Your arrival has lifted our spirits more than you can ever know. When we see you, we see strength, we see hope, we see victory." He meant every word. Churchill understood symbolism deeply, but this moment went far beyond symbolism. The American presence represented real power. Divisions that could be deployed, ships that could escort convoys, air crews that could strike deep into Germany, factories that could outproduce any nation on earth. With America fully committed, the strategic landscape transformed almost overnight. New operations could be planned, reinforcements could be sent to North Africa. The possibility of invading Italy took shape, and eventually the great task ahead, the invasion of France, could be conceived in full. The massive amphibious operation that would become known as D-Day would depend on American manpower, American air fleets, American landing craft, American industrial might. But all of that still lay in the future. In the moment when Churchill watched the Americans march through London, his thoughts rested not on specific campaigns, but on the meaning of their presence. For years, Britain had fought on with the unspoken question haunting every leader. Could the war actually be won, or was the nation merely delaying the inevitable? The Americans answered that question. With them, victory ceased to be a distant hope and became a tangible possibility. Churchill had once vowed, after the disaster of Dunkirk, that Britain would fight on the beaches and in the fields and in the streets, never surrendering. But that defiance, magnificent as it was, had rested on will rather than certainty. Now, watching the Americans march, certainty finally arrived. The burden that had weighed on him since the spring of 1940 was suddenly shared. The alliance, of course, would not be free of tension. Disputes would emerge over strategy. Churchill favoured striking at the so-called soft underbelly of Europe through Italy and the Balkans. American leaders, especially General Marshall, pushed for a direct assault on France. There were disagreements over command structures, cultural clashes between soldiers, the daily irritations inevitable when two great nations fight side by side. But none of that altered the truth Churchill recognised on that grey London afternoon. America was fully in the war now, and that changed everything. The young men he watched that day would go on to fight in deserts, in mountain passes, on beaches, in deep forests shrouded in winter cold. Many would not survive. American losses in the European theatre would reach staggering numbers, yet alongside British, Canadian, Polish, French, and other Allied forces, they would break Hitler's armies and crush the Nazi regime. The war would continue for 3 more brutal years. But from the moment Churchill saw those Americans march, the final direction of the conflict was set. Germany now faced British resolve, Soviet endurance, and American might, a combination that no dictatorship, however powerful, could withstand forever. In the years after the war, Churchill returned again and again to the idea of Anglo-American partnership. He spoke and wrote about the special relationship, urging that it be preserved in the uncertain world that followed. Some of this was strategic. Britain would need American support in the Cold War. Yet much of it was born from what he had lived through. The memory of a dark time when American arrival meant the difference between survival and defeat. The march through London was not the first time he had seen American troops, nor the last. But it was the moment when everything he had worked for, the letters to Roosevelt, the speeches, the warnings, the pleas, became real. The moment when diplomacy turned into soldiers, when promises turned into boots striking the pavement of a battered capital. And as the last American column disappeared down the street that day, Churchill felt something he had not fully felt since taking office in the spring of 1940. The belief not merely that Britain could endure, but that Britain would win. He had said it simply. "When I see these young men, I know we are going to win this war." It was not rhetoric. It was the truth he had waited so long to speak. The truth he finally saw marching past him in the form of young Americans who had crossed an ocean to fight beside his people and carry the weight of victory with them.